Chapter 1. Death After Sunday Service. The autumn morning sun cast weak rays through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, creating patterns of coloured light across the faces of the congregation as Reverend Leonard Clement delivered his final blessing. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary pew 3 rows from the front, gathered her prayer book and handbag with the unhurried precision that characterized all her movements. "A thoughtful sermon today," remarked Mrs. Price Ridley to no one in particular as the parishioners filed toward the church doors. "Though perhaps a touch long." Miss Marple merely smiled, her bright blue eyes taking in the familiar scene. Colonel Prothero straightening his military bearing as he rose from the front pew, Miss Weatherby lingering at the organ as she arranged her sheet music, and Lawrence Redding, the young artist, stretching his lanky frame after the lengthy service. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary in the village of St. Mary Mead. The parish council meeting was scheduled to commence in the church hall immediately following the service. Miss Marple made her way across the churchyard, pausing momentarily to observe Mr. Arnold Pritchard, the church treasurer, walking purposefully toward the vicarage with his leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Such dedication to church finances was admirable, though Miss Marple had noticed lately that dear Mr. Pritchard seemed rather more preoccupied than usual. Inside the church hall, the assembled council members chatted amiably while waiting for proceedings to begin. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, a pretty young woman, whose vivacious manner sometimes raised eyebrows among the more traditional parishioners, bustled about arranging chairs and distributing agendas. "Leonard will be along shortly," Griselda Clement announced cheerfully. "He and Mr. Pritchard are just reviewing some financial matters in the study." 20 minutes passed, then 30. The council members grew restless, checking their watches and exchanging glances. Miss Marple, observing the growing tension, noticed Griselda's smile becoming increasingly strained. "I'll just pop over to the vicarage with some tea," Griselda said finally, her voice perhaps a touch too bright. They must have lost track of time. She departed with a hastily assembled tea tray, leaving the council members to their murmured conversations. Miss Marple's keen ears caught fragments. "Always was meticulous with the accounts. Strange behavior lately. Heard there were concerns about the roof fund." The peaceful Sunday morning shattered with Griselda's scream. The young woman burst back into the church hall, the tea tray clattering forgotten to the floor, her face drained of all colour. "He's dead!" Mr. Pritchard, in Leonard's study. "Oh God, there's blood everywhere." Colonel Prothero was the first to react, his military training asserting itself. "Stay here, all of you. Mrs. Clement, sit down before you faint. Miss Marple, perhaps you could—" But Miss Marple was already moving, her elderly appearance belying a surprising swiftness. She followed the colonel across to the vicarage, through the familiar hallway, and into the study where she had taken tea with the vicar countless times before. The scene that greeted them was indeed shocking. Arnold Pritchard lay slumped over the vicar's mahogany desk, his bald head exhibiting a terrible wound. A heavy brass candlestick, one of a pair that usually graced the mantelpiece, lay on the floor beside him, stained with what was unmistakably blood. Papers were scattered across the desk's surface, some spotted with crimson. "Don't touch anything," Colonel Prothero commanded, though his own voice shook slightly. "Where's the vicar?" It was then that they realized Reverend Clement was nowhere to be seen. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, summoned by young Jimmy Brown, who had been dispatched on his bicycle. His examination was brief but thorough. "Blunt force trauma," he pronounced grimly. "Death would have been almost instantaneous. I'd say within the last half hour." Inspector Slack of the county police arrived with unusual promptness, his sharp features already set in lines of suspicion. "Everyone stays put," he announced. "This is a murder investigation." While the inspector began his preliminary examination of the scene, Miss Marple's observant eyes noted several curious details. Mr. Pritchard's spectacles were neatly folded in his breast pocket, though several financial ledgers lay open before him. Surely he would have needed them to read such documents. The study window stood open, allowing the October chill to penetrate the room, most unlike the vicar's usual attention to comfort. And there, on the tea tray Griselda had dropped in the doorway, were 3 china cups, not 2. "The vicar," Inspector Slack declared with grim satisfaction, "appears to be our prime suspect. Missing from the scene, last person known to be with the victim and—" he gestured to the scattered papers, "what looks very much like evidence of financial irregularities." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes continued their careful survey of the room. Something wasn't quite right, though she couldn't yet put her finger on precisely what troubled her. The mystery deepened when Reverend Clement finally appeared, hurrying up the vicarage path with his clerical collar askew and mud on his shoes. "I received an urgent message," he panted, clearly distressed. "Old Mrs. Spenlow at Fernside Cottage. She was asking for last rites. I went immediately, of course, but when I arrived, her niece said she wasn't even there." Anne Prothero, Colonel Prothero's ward, who had been helping serve refreshments after the service, looked startled. "But Aunt Spenlow's been staying with me all weekend," she said. "She's perfectly well." Inspector Slack's eyes gleamed. "Indeed? Then perhaps you'd care to explain this, Vicar." He produced a crumpled note from Mr. Pritchard's pocket, clearly written in what appeared to be Reverend Clement's distinctive handwriting. "Must speak urgently regarding grave concerns about church accounts. Private meeting essential." As the vicar stared at the note in bewilderment, Miss Marple quietly observed the reactions of those assembled. Griselda's protective movement toward her husband, Colonel Prothero's studied neutrality, Miss Weatherby's nervous fidgeting with her gloves, and Lawrence Redding's peculiar intensity as he watched the scene unfold. Something was very wrong indeed in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple suspected that the truth behind Arnold Pritchard's death was far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward theory suggested. As she had often observed, human nature was the same everywhere, whether in a great city or a small village, and where there were secrets, there was always the potential for murder. Chapter 2. The Missing Church Funds. Inspector Slack established himself in the vicarage drawing-room with the air of a man who intended to make quick work of what he clearly considered an open-and-shut case. The Reverend Leonard Clement sat opposite him, his usually cheerful countenance drawn with worry, while Griselda hovered protectively nearby, her hand occasionally brushing her husband's shoulder in a gesture of support. "Now then, Vicar," Inspector Slack began, his tone making it abundantly clear that the title held no particular reverence for him. "Perhaps you'd care to explain why you lied about your whereabouts at the time of the murder?" "I did not lie," Reverend Clement protested, though his voice lacked its customary confidence. "I received a message no one else saw, about a parishioner who wasn't actually dying, who happened to be away from home at the precise moment you claim to have visited." The inspector's smile held no warmth. "Rather convenient, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple, who had been asked to remain as a witness to the discovery of the body, sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking softly. Few people noticed when Miss Marple was thinking deeply, which suited her purposes admirably. "But someone sent that message," Griselda interjected. "Someone who wanted Leonard away from the vicarage at that particular time." Or someone who wanted to establish an alibi, Inspector Slack countered. I understand there have been some financial difficulties at the vicarage? The Reverend Clement flushed. It's no secret that a clerical living doesn't provide abundantly, Inspector. But I would never. We shall see what you would or wouldn't do when we've had a proper look at those church accounts Mr. Pritchard was so concerned about. As if on cue, Colonel Prothero appeared in the doorway, his military bearing somewhat diminished by the gravity of his expression. Inspector, I've completed a preliminary review of the church finances as you requested. I'm afraid there's rather disturbing news. Out with it, then. There appears to be a significant discrepancy in the restoration fund. Nearly £500 is unaccounted for, money specifically collected for repairs to the church roof. The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Inspector Slack's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, while Reverend Clement's face drained of what little colour remained. £500, the inspector repeated slowly. That's quite a sum. Enough to solve those financial difficulties you mentioned, eh, Vicar? This is preposterous, Griselda burst out. Leonard would never steal from the church. The evidence will tell us what the Reverend would or wouldn't do, Mrs. Clement. Inspector Slack rose. I think we'll continue this conversation at the station. Reverend Clement, if you would come with me. It was at this moment that Miss Marple quietly cleared her throat. I do beg your pardon, Inspector, but might I ask where these preliminary findings came from? You've been rather occupied with your interrogation. Colonel Prothero has been reviewing the accounts while I questioned suspects, Slack replied impatiently. Ah, yes, quite proper. Though I can't help wondering. Colonel, didn't you mention at the parish meeting last month that you had mislaid your reading glasses? How remarkable that you've managed such a detailed review so quickly. The colonel shifted uncomfortably. Found them, didn't I? In my study just this morning? How fortunate, Miss Marple murmured, returning to her knitting. The afternoon was fading when Miss Marple presented herself at the Pritchard residence, a modest house on the outskirts of the village. Mrs. Pritchard, a thin, nervous woman who had always reminded Miss Marple of an anxious hen, received her in a sitting-room that spoke of genteel poverty rather than the comfortable circumstances one might expect of a church treasurer's home. So kind of you to call, Miss Marple, Mrs. Pritchard said, her hands twisting a black-bordered handkerchief. Though I confess I'm rather at 6s and 7s. The police were here earlier, asking such questions. Such a terrible shock for you, my dear. Mr. Pritchard was always so devoted to his church duties. Oh yes, perhaps too devoted lately. These past few weeks, he's been quite consumed by the accounts. Up at all hours, making telephone calls to London. Most unlike Arnold, who always said banking business should be conducted in proper hours. Telephone calls to London? Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. To some bank where he didn't even have an account, if you can believe it. Westminster Trust, I think it was. And there were those arguments. Arguments? With Miss Weatherby, of all people? Just last week I saw them having quite a heated discussion outside the post office. About the music budget, Arnold said later, though why that should require such passion I couldn't say. Miss Marple stored this information away carefully. It must have been a great strain on you both. Well, Arnold had been rather preoccupied, and there were those payments. Payments? Mrs. Pritchard coloured slightly. I shouldn't have looked, but when one's husband behaves so oddly, I found entries in his private account book. Regular payments, all marked insurance against spiritual matters. Such a peculiar phrase, don't you think? I wondered if perhaps Arnold was being blackmailed. Before Miss Marple could pursue this intriguing revelation, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Pritchard excused herself and returned with Inspector Slack. "Ah, Miss Marple. Paying condolence calls, are we?" "One does what one can in times of tragedy, Inspector." "Quite. Well, you'll be interested to know that we've made significant progress. The murder weapon has been found, wrapped in a clerical stole and hidden in the church vestry. The Reverend Clement's fingerprints are all over it." "How very careless of him," Miss Marple observed mildly, "to hide the murder weapon in his own church, wrapped in his own vestment, covered with his own fingerprints." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he found nothing odd about this at all. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the church, where she found Miss Weatherby practicing for evening service. The organist, a woman of perhaps 50, with the ramrod posture of one who had spent her life maintaining propriety, initially pretended not to notice her visitor. "Such a difficult day for everyone," Miss Marple began, settling herself in a pew. "That piece you're playing, Bach, isn't it? So soothing in troubled times." Miss Weatherby's hands stilled on the keys. "What do you want, Miss Marple?" "I couldn't help but admire your brooch at the service this morning. Such an unusual design. Arts and crafts, I believe. One doesn't often see such fine pieces in St. Mary Mead." The organist's hand flew to her collar, where an ornate silver brooch gleamed. "It was a gift? From a cousin? How generous. Your cousin must be quite prosperous." Yes, I suppose so. It's interesting how often generous cousins appear just when one needs them. Rather like Mr. Pritchard's mysterious payments for spiritual insurance, don't you think?" Miss Weatherby's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do, my dear. Just as I think you know why Mr. Pritchard was making those calls to Westminster Trust, a bank that specializes, I believe, in handling delicate financial matters for those who prefer discretion." Before Miss Weatherby could respond, Lawrence Redding burst into the church, his artistic dishevelment more pronounced than usual. "Miss Weatherby, have you heard? They've arrested the vicar." As Miss Marple made her way home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the day's discoveries. The missing money, the mysterious payments, the hidden murder weapon. All pieces of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly complex. She thought about the neat signatures in the church registers, the peculiarity of those withdrawals requiring 2 signatures, and the way certain numbers didn't quite align with others. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to the post office. Mrs. Hartnell, the postmistress, had an excellent memory for unusual correspondence, and perhaps afterward she might examine those church registers more carefully. There was something about the handwriting that had been nagging at her all day, something about the way certain letters were formed and how they differed from one entry to the next. As she turned into her own lane, Miss Marple noticed 2 figures in the churchyard, deep in conversation. Even in the fading light, she recognized Colonel Prothero's military bearing and Miss Weatherby's distinctive silhouette. They stood very close together, far closer than mere church business would require. "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "Most interesting indeed." Chapter 3. Suspicious Parishioners. The village of St. Mary Mead had divided itself with remarkable efficiency into 2 distinct camps by Monday morning. Those who believed in Reverend Clement's innocence gathered in worried clusters outside the bakery and post office, while those convinced of his guilt held court in the Blue Boar, nodding sagely at each other's theories about clerical corruption and the temptations of easy money. Miss Marple, belonging firmly to the former group though she kept her own counsel, set out early for Miss Weatherby's cottage, a neat dwelling overshadowed by ancient elm trees at the far end of the village. The pretext was the flower rota, a subject that could legitimately occupy two churchwomen for considerable time. But her true purpose was far more serious. Miss Weatherby answered the door herself, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she ushered Miss Marple into a sitting room dominated by an upright piano and shelves of music scores. "How kind of you to call about the flowers," Miss Weatherby began, her voice artificially bright. "Though with everything that's happened, I wonder if we should even bother with the altar arrangements this week. The church must continue its observances, whatever trials we face," Miss Marple replied gently, settling herself in a wing chair. "Though I must confess, I'm rather more concerned about you, my dear. You seem quite distressed." "Distressed? Well, naturally, we're all shocked by Mr. Pritchard's death, ... And by your argument with him last Tuesday outside the post office?" Miss Weatherby's hand flew to her throat, where today she wore a simple cameo instead of the ornate silver brooch. "Oh, that. A silly misunderstanding about the music budget. Arnold could be rather particular about expenses." "Indeed? Though it seems odd that he should object to music expenditures while apparently approving Mr. Redding's rather costly mural project." "That was different," Miss Weatherby said quickly. "The mural was, that is, Colonel Prothero particularly supported it." "Ah, yes, Colonel Prothero. You work quite closely with him on church matters, don't you?" A faint flush coloured the organist's cheeks. "We both serve on the parish council. Naturally, we consult on various issues." Miss Marple's keen eyes had already noted several telling details about the room. A man's glove, forgotten on the piano, 2 brandy glasses hastily pushed behind some sheet music, and most significantly, a small photograph of Colonel Prothero, partially hidden among the musical scores on the mantelpiece. "Your new brooch yesterday was quite striking," Miss Marple observed, changing tack. "Such fine craftsmanship." "As I mentioned, it was a gift from a cousin." "Yes, you did say that. Though I couldn't help wondering, your cousin must have exquisite taste. The brooch looked remarkably like one I saw in Harrington's jewellery shop window last month. Quite expensive, as I recall." Miss Weatherby stood abruptly. "I really must practice for Wednesday's service, if there's nothing else about the flowers." "Just one more thing, my dear. When you spoke with Mr. Pritchard that day, did he happen to mention anything about unauthorized changes to financial records?" The organist's face went pale. No, of course not. Why would he discuss such things with me?" "No reason at all," Miss Marple replied mildly, rising to leave. "Though it is curious how many people seem to have been involved with those church accounts lately." After leaving Miss Weatherby's cottage, Miss Marple made her way to the church, where she found Lawrence Redding high on a scaffold, working on his controversial mural. The young artist, paint-stained and tousled, descended when he saw her. "Miss Marple, come to inspect my handiwork?" "It's progressing beautifully," she replied, studying the half-completed scene of St. George and the Dragon. "Though I understand not everyone approves of the expense." Redding's expression darkened. "Pritchard certainly didn't. Called it frivolous waste at the last council meeting. Said the money should go to practical repairs instead. Yet the project was approved. Colonel Prothero pushed it through. He has quite an appreciation for the arts." Redding's tone suggested something more than simple gratitude. Inspector Slack chose that moment to appear, notebook in hand. "Mr. Redding, a few more questions about yesterday morning." "I've already told you everything, Inspector. I left right after the service, spoke briefly with Anne Prothero about art matters, and went home to work on some sketches." Miss Marple, arranging chrysanthemums in a vase nearby, noticed Redding's nervous glance toward the vestry door as he spoke. "And you saw nothing unusual?" "Heard nothing." "Nothing at all." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple continued her flower arranging, carefully observing as Redding returned to his mural. His brush strokes were noticeably less steady than before, and he kept glancing toward the vestry as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge. That afternoon brought a startling development. Colonel Prothero appeared at the police station, his military bearing crumbling as he made a dramatic confession. "I've been stealing from the Restoration Fund," he announced to a stunned Inspector Slack. "Pritchard discovered my theft. I had no choice but to silence him." The news spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. By tea-time, Miss Marple found herself receiving a procession of visitors, each eager to share their theories about this unexpected turn of events. It was during Mrs. Price Ridley's particularly verbose analysis that Miss Marple noticed something odd about the Colonel's confession. "He claims to have struck Pritchard with the candlestick," she murmured, more to herself than her guest. "Well, naturally. That was the murder weapon, wasn't it?" "Yes, but—" Miss Marple frowned, recalling the scene in the study. The angle of the wound, as Dr. Haydock described it, suggested the blow came from someone shorter than the victim. Colonel Prothero is considerably taller than Mr. Pritchard was. Perhaps Pritchard was standing when struck. The blood pattern on the desk suggested otherwise. And there's another thing. The medical evidence indicated death occurred around 11:30, yet several people saw the Colonel in the church hall until at least 11:25. Could he really have committed the murder and returned in just 5 minutes? Mrs. Price Ridley had no answer to this, and soon departed in search of fresher gossip. Miss Marple, left alone with her thoughts, found herself considering the various pieces of her puzzle. Miss Weatherby's expensive brooch, and her relationship with the Colonel, Lawrence Redding's nervous behavior and inflated payments for the mural, the mysterious withdrawals requiring 2 signatures, and now this suspicious confession. As evening approached, she decided to pay one more call. Mrs. Pritchard, still in deep mourning, seemed surprised but not displeased to see her again. "I've brought some of my special chamomile tea," Miss Marple explained. "So soothing for the nerves." Over tea, she gently steered the conversation back to Mr. Pritchard's concerns about the church finances. "You mentioned those mysterious payments yesterday. Insurance against spiritual matters. Did your husband keep detailed records of these transactions?" "Oh, yes. Arnold was meticulous about records. He had a private ledger. The police took it, of course. But I remember seeing regular entries, always the same amount, always on the 15th of each month." "And these payments began when?" "About 6 months ago, I think, around the time the Restoration Fund was established." Mrs. Pritchard paused, her brow furrowing. "Actually, it was just after that unpleasant business with the Redding boy." "Unpleasant business?" "Oh, nothing serious. Some dispute about a painting commission that fell through. Arnold never told me the details, but I remember he and Colonel Prothero had several heated discussions about it." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Pritchard added something that made her pause at the door. "There's one thing I didn't tell the police. It seemed too fantastic. But the night before he died, Arnold said something strange. He said he'd finally worked out how they were doing it, and that by Monday morning everything would be revealed. He seemed almost triumphant." Walking home through the darkening village, Miss Marple's mind worked methodically through the accumulating evidence. The forged signatures on the withdrawal forms were becoming clearer in her mind. Not the work of one person, but possibly several. The timing of the mysterious payments coinciding with the establishment of the Restoration Fund was surely significant. And then there was the curious fact of the 3 teacups. As she passed the churchyard, she noticed 2 figures in earnest conversation near the lich gate. Even in the dim light, she recognized Miss Weatherby's distinctive silhouette and Colonel Prothero's military posture. They stood very close together, their heads bent in intimate discussion, apparently unaware of her presence. Miss Marple paused, pretending to adjust her shawl while straining to catch their words. She heard only fragments. "Confession won't hold. Protect you. The Reading boy knows too much." As she continued homeward, Miss Marple reflected that tomorrow would require a visit to the vicarage. There were questions about that 3rd teacup that needed answering, and she suspected Griselda Clement might hold the key to at least part of this increasingly complex puzzle. The truth, she felt certain, was beginning to emerge, though it was proving far more intricate than even she had initially suspected. Chapter 4. The Vicar's Secret. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage on Tuesday morning to find Griselda Clement in the garden, absently deadheading roses with the distracted air of someone whose mind was very far from horticultural matters. The young woman's usually vibrant complexion was pale, and her red-gold hair, normally so carefully arranged, hung in dishevelled waves about her shoulders. "My dear Griselda," Miss Marple began gently, "you look quite exhausted. Have you been sleeping at all?" "How can I sleep when Leonard is in that horrible cell?" Griselda's voice cracked. "They won't even let me bring him his books. He asked specifically for his St. Augustine, and that awful Inspector Slack said prisoners weren't allowed philosophical texts, as if Augustine could help anyone escape." "Most trying. Perhaps a cup of tea would help? I notice you have the kettle on already." They moved into the vicarage kitchen, where Griselda mechanically prepared tea. Miss Marple noticed 3 cups set out on the tray, an unconscious habit, perhaps, or something more significant. "Griselda, dear, I've been wondering about that tea tray yesterday. When you discovered poor Mr. Pritchard, there were 3 cups upon it." The younger woman's hand trembled slightly as she poured. "Yes, I was going to join them for the discussion about the church accounts. But you said yesterday that you were merely bringing tea to your husband and Mr. Pritchard." "Did I? I suppose I was rather confused. It was such a shock, you see. Of course. Though it does seem odd that you would join a private financial discussion, particularly one that Mr. Pritchard had specifically requested with your husband." Griselda set down the teapot with unnecessary force. "All right, if you must know, I was worried. Leonard had been behaving so strangely lately, and when Mr. Pritchard asked for that private meeting, I thought Leonard might need support, or a witness." "A witness to what, my dear?" Before Griselda could answer, heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Inspector Slack, accompanied by Constable Hurst. The inspector's face bore its customary expression of grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Clement, I'm afraid I have some questions about your husband's alibi. We've made some rather interesting discoveries." "What sort of discoveries?" Griselda's voice was barely above a whisper. "For starters, your husband's story about being called to Mrs. Spenlow's bedside is completely fabricated. The lady was in Brighton all weekend, as her niece has confirmed. Your husband lied about his whereabouts at the time of the murder. There must be some explanation." "Oh, I'm sure there is. Just as I'm sure there's an explanation for why he withdrew £200 from his personal account last Thursday. Cash, Mrs. Clement. What would a vicar need with that much cash?" Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately. "If I might ask, Inspector, have you considered that someone else might have sent that message to lure the vicar away?" And why would anyone do that? To ensure he would be absent during the murder, perhaps? And to cast suspicion upon him afterward? The inspector snorted. You're suggesting someone framed the vicar. Next, you'll be telling me that Colonel Prothero's confession is false too. Well, as to that. But Inspector Slack was already turning back to Griselda. Mrs. Clement, I must ask you to accompany us to the station. There are some items we found in your husband's study that require explanation. After they departed, Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage kitchen thinking. The Clements' financial difficulties were well known in the village, yet Leonard had withdrawn a substantial sum just days before the murder. The false message about Mrs. Spenlow suggested careful planning, but whose? Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, looking more dishevelled than usual. Miss Marple, I thought I might find you here. I've just come from examining that candlestick again at Slack's request. Something's been bothering me about it. Indeed. The bloodstains, you see. They're on the wrong part of the candlestick for the angle of the wound. It's as if someone deliberately bloodied it after the fact. How very interesting. You mean the candlestick might not be the murder weapon at all? Exactly. I think poor Pritchard was killed with something else entirely, and the candlestick was staged, if you will. After the doctor left, Miss Marple decided to visit the church once more. In the vestry, she examined the spot where the blood-stained candlestick had been found, wrapped in the vicar's own stole. Such an obvious hiding place, almost insultingly so. Her contemplation was interrupted by voices from the main church. Peering around the vestry door, she saw Anne Prothero in intense conversation with Lawrence Redding. "We have to tell them," Anne was saying urgently. "Are you mad? After what's happened? But if we don't, the vicar's troubles are his own affair. We stick to our story." They moved away, their voices fading, but Miss Marple had heard enough to deepen her suspicions. She was about to leave when she noticed something on the floor near the altar, a small piece of paper, folded and refolded many times. Opening it carefully, she found a series of numbers and dates, with 2 sets of initials beside each entry. A P and LR. That evening, Inspector Slack was forced to release Griselda due to lack of evidence, though he continued to hold the vicar. It was then that Leonard Clement finally broke down and confessed his secret, though not to murder. "I was being blackmailed," he admitted to Inspector Slack, with Miss Marple present as a witness. "Not by Pritchard, as you seem to think, but by someone who knew about something that happened before I took holy orders." The story that emerged was both pathetic and oddly touching. As a young man, Leonard had fallen in with bad company and accumulated gambling debts. In desperation, he had participated in a check-forging scheme, was arrested, and spent 3 months in prison. He had never disclosed this to the church authorities when he later felt called to the ministry. "The first demand came 6 months ago," he explained. £200, or they would expose my past to the bishop. I've been paying ever since, always on the 15th of each month. "But who was blackmailing you?" Slack demanded. "I never knew. The instructions were always left in the poor box, telling me where to leave the money. Last Sunday, I received a note demanding I meet the blackmailer during the time I was supposed to be with Pritchard. They said it was urgent, that they had new demands." "And you went?" "Of course I went, but no one showed up. I waited at the old mill for nearly an hour, then hurried back. That's when I found everyone in an uproar and poor Pritchard." Miss Marple spoke up. "Did you keep any of these blackmail notes?" "The first few, yes, but they were all typewritten, no signatures." "And the money?" Where did you leave it? Different places each time. Under the Lich Gate, behind the War Memorial, in the old hollow oak in Dymchurch Lane. Later, walking home through the darkening village, Miss Marple pondered this new information. The vicar's secret explained his mysterious behaviour and the cash withdrawal. But it raised new questions. Who had been blackmailing him? And more importantly, who had used that knowledge to ensure his absence during Pritchard's murder? She thought about the piece of paper she'd found in the church. Those initials A.P. and L.R. beside dates and amounts. Anne Prothero and Lawrence Redding? It seemed they had secrets of their own. As she passed the Prothero house, she noticed a light in the Colonel's study. Through the window she could see him at his desk, apparently destroying documents, feeding papers into the fireplace with systematic efficiency. Curious behaviour for a man who had already confessed to embezzlement and murder. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, was becoming clearer, though more complex than she had initially suspected. The embezzlement was real, but involved multiple parties. The blackmail was real, but served a dual purpose. And the murder? Well, that was perhaps the most intricate deception of all. Tomorrow, she decided, she would have to speak with Anne Prothero. The young woman's reluctance to identify whoever she had seen entering the vicarage through the garden door was becoming increasingly significant. And those initials on that paper, combined with the whispered conversation she'd overheard, suggested that Anne knew far more than she had admitted. As she reached her gate, Miss Marple paused, struck by a sudden thought. Those parish records she'd examined, the ones with the signatures that seemed somehow different. What if the forgeries weren't limited to the financial documents? What if someone had been systematically altering other records as well? The morning, she decided, would require another visit to the church. But this time, she would bring her magnifying glass. Some truths, after all, could only be seen when one looked very, very closely. Chapter 5. Tea with the Witness. Wednesday morning found Miss Marple in her garden, ostensibly tending to her herbaceous borders, while actually observing Anne Prothero as she walked past toward the village shops. The young woman's steps were hurried, her shoulders tense, and she glanced frequently over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Such behaviour, Miss Marple reflected, was most unlike the usually composed ward of Colonel Prothero. By afternoon, Miss Marple had arranged what appeared to be a chance encounter at the tea shop, where Anne sat alone at a corner table, her cup untouched before her. "My dear Anne, you look quite troubled. May I join you?" Anne started visibly, then managed a weak smile. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I'm afraid I'm not very good company today." "These are difficult times for us all," Miss Marple agreed, settling herself and ordering tea. "Your guardian's confession has shocked everyone, though I must confess, some aspects of it puzzle me greatly." "Puzzle you?" "Well, yes. For instance, the Colonel claims to have killed Mr. Pritchard with that candlestick, yet Dr. Haydock has some doubts about whether it was truly the murder weapon. And then there's the timing. Could your guardian really have committed the murder and returned to the church hall so quickly?" Anne's hands trembled as she lifted her cup. I wouldn't know about such things." "Of course not, dear, though I've been wondering about something else. You were helping with refreshments after the service, weren't you? Did you happen to notice anyone entering the vicarage through the garden door?" The cup clattered back into its saucer. "The garden door? Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely curious. You see, that door provides such convenient access to the vicar's study, yet few people seem to use it, almost as if they don't know it exists." "I didn't see anything," Anne said quickly. Too quickly. "Are you quite certain?" Because Mrs. Bantry mentioned seeing you in the churchyard around that time, looking toward the vicarage with what she described as an expression of great alarm. Anne's composure crumbled. All right. Yes, I saw someone. But I can't. I won't say who it was. Because you're protecting them. Because it would ruin everything. The words burst out before Anne could stop them. She pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes wide with distress. Miss Marple regarded her calmly. My dear, I think perhaps you should tell me about your engagement to Mr. Redding. How did you... We've kept it completely secret. St. Mary Mead has a few secrets from those who know how to observe, and Mr. Redding has been rather obvious in his attentions, despite your attempts at discretion. Anne slumped in her chair. We couldn't announce it. Uncle wouldn't approve. He thinks Lawrence is an unsuitable match. No money, you see, just his art. We've been waiting until Lawrence establishes himself. Through commissions like the church mural? Exactly, though that payment has been complicated. Complicated how? Anne hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. Miss Marple, will you promise that what I tell you won't automatically go to that awful Inspector Slack? I promise only to pursue justice, my dear. Sometimes that requires discretion. Sometimes it demands revelation. Fair enough. Anne took a deep breath. Lawrence and I discovered something about Uncle several months ago. He's been having an affair with Miss Weatherby. Ah, said Miss Marple, unsurprised. We saw them together one evening in London. Uncle was supposed to be at his club. Instead, he was dining with Evelyn Weatherby at the Savoy, and they were... well, it was perfectly clear they were intimate. And you used this information? Anne flushed. Not for money. Well, not exactly. We just suggested to Uncle that he might be more supportive of Lawrence's artistic endeavors, the mural commission, specifically. And Uncle agreed, rather quickly. I see. And was this the only secret you discovered? At first, yes. But then Lawrence noticed something odd about the payments for his work. The amount approved by the parish council was £100, but Uncle authorized payment of £300. Lawrence mentioned it to me, and I started paying attention to the church finances. And what did you discover? That Uncle and Miss Weatherby had been taking money from the restoration fund. Not large amounts at first, just enough to cover their hotel bills, their little trips together. But then it grew larger. They were planning to run away together, you see. Start fresh somewhere where no one knew them. And Mr. Pritchard discovered this? Last week. He confronted Uncle after the Thursday service. I overheard part of their argument. Mr. Pritchard said he had evidence, cancelled checks, forged signatures, the lot. He was going to expose everything at the next parish council meeting. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. Which brings us back to Sunday morning. You did see someone entering the vicarage through the garden door, didn't you? Anne nodded miserably. I saw someone in a dark coat, but I couldn't see their face clearly. They were moving quickly, furtively. I knew I should have said something, but I was afraid it might have been Lawrence. Why would you think that? Because he'd been behaving so strangely that morning, nervous, distracted, and he kept checking his watch during the service, as if he had somewhere else to be. Did you ask him about it? Later, yes. He said he was worried about Uncle's confession, thought it might affect our plans. But there was something he wasn't telling me. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. Anne, I must ask you something rather important. Those initials I found on a paper in the church, a P and LR, beside various dates and amounts. What do they refer to? Anne's face went white. You found that? Oh God. We're finished. My dear, I think you'd better tell me everything. The story that emerged was one of cascading deceptions. Anne and Lawrence had been blackmailing not just the Colonel, but the vicar as well. They had discovered Reverend Clement's prison record through a chance encounter with someone who had known him in his youth. The amounts listed on that paper were their earnings from both schemes. We never meant for anyone to get hurt, Anne insisted. We just wanted enough money to get married, to start our life together. Lawrence is so talented, but art doesn't pay unless you have connections. We thought this was our only chance. And the murder? Did you and Lawrence have anything to do with that? No, I swear it. We were as shocked as anyone when Mr. Pritchard was killed. Yet you were both behaving suspiciously that morning. Because we knew our schemes might be exposed. Mr. Pritchard had been getting too close to the truth about Uncle's embezzlement. We were afraid he might discover our blackmail operations as well. Miss Marple studied the young woman's face carefully. Despite her admitted crimes, Anne seemed genuinely distressed about the murder. But if she and Lawrence hadn't killed Pritchard, and if the Colonel's confession was false... Anne, I need you to think very carefully. The person you saw entering the vicarage, was there anything distinctive about them? Anything at all? Anne closed her eyes, concentrating. The coat was dark, possibly black, and there was something odd about their walk, a slight limp, perhaps. Or maybe they were carrying something heavy, and... Wait, there was something else, a glint of silver at their throat, like a brooch catching the light. Miss Marple sat back, the pieces finally falling into place. A silver brooch, the carefully staged crime scene, the forged signatures, the systematic embezzlement, and most telling of all, the third teacup on that fatal tray. Thank you, Anne. You've been most helpful. What happens now? Will you tell Inspector Slack about what Lawrence and I did? That remains to be seen. For now, I suggest you go home and tell your guardian that his confession won't hold up under scrutiny. The real murderer made several critical mistakes, and I believe I know exactly who they are. After Anne departed, Miss Marple remained at the tea shop, piecing together the final elements of the puzzle. The murder weapon wasn't the candlestick at all. It was something else entirely, something that would have been readily available in the vicar's study. The killer had counted on the various criminal activities, the embezzlement, the blackmail, the affairs, to create enough confusion to cover their tracks. But they hadn't counted on a sharp-eyed spinster who understood that in a village like St. Mary Mead, the most complicated explanation was rarely the correct one. Sometimes, murder was simply about removing an obstacle, permanently. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would arrange that gathering at the vicarage. It was time to reveal the truth about Arnold Pritchard's death, and to show how human greed and fear had transformed a house of God into a den of thieves, with one cold-blooded killer among them. Chapter 6, The Final Prayer. Thursday afternoon found Miss Marple's small sitting room transformed into a court of inquiry, with Inspector Slack positioned by the door like a suspicious mastiff. The vicar and Griselda Clement sat together on the sofa, while Colonel Prothero occupied the armchair with military stiffness. Anne Prothero and Lawrence Redding had taken the window seat, their hands not quite touching, and Miss Weatherby perched on a straight-backed chair, her face pale and drawn. "This is highly irregular," Inspector Slack protested for the third time. "The Colonel has confessed. The case is closed." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Then perhaps you can explain why Colonel Prothero claims to have used the brass candlestick when Dr. Haydock has proven it wasn't the murder weapon at all." The colonel shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps I was confused about the details? Indeed. Just as you were confused about the timing. You claim to have killed Mr. Pritchard at 11:30, yet multiple witnesses place you in the church hall until 11:25. The vicarage is a 5-minute walk, and that's without allowing time for the murder itself. I walked quickly. Through the main door, past Mrs. Bantry in the churchyard. Strange that she didn't see you. Miss Marple turned to address the room. The truth is rather different, isn't it? The embezzlement from the Restoration Fund was quite real. That much of the colonel's confession is accurate. But it wasn't his scheme alone. She looked at Miss Weatherby, whose hands were clenched in her lap. You and Colonel Prothero had been conducting an affair for some time. You needed money to start a new life together, somewhere far from the gossip of St. Mary Mead. The colonel began taking small amounts from the church funds, using his position as churchwarden to authorize withdrawals. That's libel, Colonel Prothero blustered. Is it? I have your own documents, Colonel, the ones you were burning last night. Fortunately, Mrs. Henderson, who cleans for you, rescued several partially burned papers from the fireplace this morning. They tell quite a story. Miss Marple continued relentlessly. When Mr. Pritchard began to suspect something was amiss, you panicked. But you didn't resort to murder. Instead, you involved Miss Weatherby in your scheme. She could forge the vicar's signature quite skillfully, couldn't she? All those years of copying musical manuscripts had given her a steady hand. Miss Weatherby's voice was barely audible. We never meant to take so much. It just grew. Indeed. And when Mr. Pritchard discovered the full extent of your theft, you knew you were finished. But murder, Colonel? That wasn't your style, was it? Instead, you chose to confess, hoping to shield Miss Weatherby from prosecution. How very gallant. But someone did murder Mr. Pritchard, Lawrence Redding interjected. If not the colonel, then who? Miss Marple's eyes turned to Anne Prothero. Our young friend here discovered her guardian's affair and his embezzlement. She and Mr. Redding decided to use this information for their own purposes. Blackmail is such an ugly word, but that's what it was, wasn't it? Anne nodded miserably. We just wanted enough money to get married. Lawrence's art. Yes. And you discovered something else, didn't you? The vicar's shameful secret. A perfect opportunity for a second income stream. You've both been quite industrious these past months. Inspector Slack was scribbling furiously in his notebook. Are you saying these two killed Pritchard? No, Inspector. They were too busy with their various schemes to commit murder. Besides, Anne saw the real killer entering the vicarage that morning. Someone wearing a dark coat and a silver brooch. Someone who had been in the vicar's study many times before, and knew exactly where to find what they needed. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and produced the piece of paper she'd found in the church. This is a record of your blackmail payments, isn't it? A P and L.R., Anne Prothero and Lawrence Redding. But there's another set of initials here that puzzled me at first. G.C. Not the colonel, not the vicar. So who could G.C. be? All eyes turned to Griselda Clement. The third teacup on the tray was the key, Miss Marple continued. You said you intended to join the financial discussion, but that was a lie. The third cup was for Mr. Pritchard's tea. He took it with lemon, while your husband prefers milk. You were already in the study when your husband left for his supposed urgent call. You'd arranged that absence yourself, sending a note to lure him away. This is absurd, Griselda protested. Is it? Mr. Pritchard had discovered not only the colonel's embezzlement, but also the blackmail schemes. He knew about your husband's past, and he'd figured out that Anne and Lawrence were extorting money from both your husband and the colonel. but most importantly, he'd discovered something about you. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but inexorable. You weren't just an innocent bystander, were you, Griselda? You were the mastermind behind it all. While Anne and Lawrence conducted their amateur blackmail operation, you were systematically helping the Colonel and Miss Weatherby steal from the church funds. Why? Because you knew that if the restoration fund was depleted, the church would have to sell that valuable medieval manuscript in the vestry, the one your art dealer brother in London had already found a buyer for. Griselda's face had gone white. You can't prove any of this. Can't I? The murder weapon wasn't the candlestick at all. It was the letter opener from your husband's desk, the one with the heavy jade handle. You struck Mr. Pritchard from behind while he was seated, reading the evidence he'd compiled. The angle of the wound confirms the killer was shorter than the victim. Then you staged the scene with the candlestick, hid it in the vestry wrapped in your husband's stole, and rejoined the parish council meeting. But the blood, Inspector Slack began, was minimal. Head wounds can be like that sometimes, as Dr. Haydock confirmed. Griselda wore a dark coat from the vestry coat rack, the same one Anne saw. After the murder, she simply hung it back up. No one noticed because everyone was focused on the more obvious evidence. Griselda looked around the room wildly. Leonard, surely you don't believe— The silver brooch, the vicar said quietly. You were wearing my mother's silver cross that morning. You never wear it to church because you say it's too ostentatious. I believe, Miss Marple said, that if Inspector Slack examines the jade letter opener in the vicar's study, he'll find traces of blood in the crevices of the handle. And if he checks the dark coat in the vestry, he might find a spot or two that the murderer missed. Griselda suddenly jumped to her feet. Yes, all right. I killed him. He was going to ruin everything. Leonard's career, our life here, my chance to finally have something of my own. That manuscript was worth a fortune, and these pious fools were just letting it moulder in the vestry. Griselda, the vicar whispered, devastated. Oh, Leonard, dear, sweet, naive Leonard. You never saw what was right in front of you. I married you thinking a vicar's wife would have some standing, some respect. Instead, I got genteel poverty and endless parish duties. When I found out about your past, I thought I could at least use it to our advantage. But you're too honourable even for that. Inspector Slack moved forward. Griselda Clement, I arrest you for the murder of Arnold Pritchard. As the inspector led Griselda away, the vicar sat stunned, while the others shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple quietly began gathering the evidence she'd presented. What happens now? Anne Prothero asked in a small voice. That's for the authorities to decide, Miss Marple replied. Though I suspect there will be sufficient complications to keep everyone busy with their own affairs for some time. Later, after the police had gone and statements had been taken, Miss Marple walked to the church for evening prayer. The vicar, released at last, stood at the altar, his voice steady despite his personal devastation as he led the small congregation through the familiar service. As the final blessing was pronounced, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of human frailty. Greed, deception, blackmail, and murder all had flourished in this holy place. Yet here, too, were examples of love, loyalty, and the possibility of redemption. The restoration fund would eventually be replenished, primarily from Colonel Prothero's personal fortune. The manuscript would remain safely in the vestry, and the village of St. Mary Mead would slowly return to its peaceful routines, though perhaps with a greater awareness of the secrets that could lurk behind even the most respectable facades. As Miss Marple knelt for private prayer in the quiet church, she offered thanks for the resolution of the case and the restoration of justice. Outside, the evening bells tolled across the village, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in the endless story of human nature, with all its capacity for both darkness and light.